You're standing in line at a coffee shop. The person ahead of you swipes a credit card. Approved. They walk away with a latte. You do the same. But here's what just happened that neither of you saw. Somewhere in the background, a number got smaller. Not your balance, something else. Something that decides whether the lights stay on in your city tonight. It's called the reserve requirement. And there's a rule buried in how it works that most people will never hear about. Not because it's secret, because it's boring. Until it isn't. Let me show you why $20,000 matters more than you think. Here's the thing about money. Most of it doesn't exist. Not in the way you think it does. Right now, in the United States, there's about $2.3 trillion in physical cash, bills and coins, the stuff you can hold. But the total money supply? Depending on how you measure it, somewhere between $21 and $23 trillion. That gap isn't a rounding error. It's the entire system. The rest is digital, numbers in accounts, promises between banks, and it all runs on a mechanism so mundane that it rarely makes the news, except when it breaks. That mechanism is called fractional reserve banking, and the $20,000 rule sits right at its center. Let's say you deposit $20,000 into your bank. You think it just sits there. It doesn't. The bank is required to keep a fraction of that deposit in reserve. Historically, in the US, that fraction was around 10%. So out of your $20,000, the bank holds $2,000. The other $18,000, they lend it out to someone buying a car, starting a business, paying for a wedding. That person deposits the $18,000 in their bank. That bank now keeps 10% of it, $1,800, and lends out $16,200, which gets deposited, which gets lent, again and again. Your original $20,000 doesn't multiply, it echoes. By the time the system is done cycling it through, that single deposit has created roughly $200,000 in total money supply, 10 times what you put in. This is called the money multiplier effect, and it's not a glitch, it's the design. Here's where it gets strange. In March 2020, the Federal Reserve changed the rules. They dropped the reserve requirement to 0, not 10%, not 5%, 0. Technically, banks no longer have to hold any of your deposit in reserve. They can lend all of it. The $20,000 rule stopped being a rule. Why? The official reason was to increase liquidity during the pandemic, give banks more flexibility, keep credit flowing. But it also meant something else. The main brake on money creation was removed, and most people didn't notice. Because by that point, reserves had stopped mattering the way they used to. Let's rewind. For most of the 20th century, reserve requirements were a real constraint. If banks lent too much, they'd run out of reserves. They'd have to stop. It was a speed limit on the system. But over time, central banks started using other tools. Interest rates, open market operations, paying interest on reserves themselves. The old-fashioned reserve ratio became less relevant. By 2020, many banks were already holding excess reserves, way more than required. So when the Fed set the requirement to 0, it wasn't chaos. It was acknowledgement. The rule had already stopped ruling. But that raises a question. If reserves don't limit lending anymore, what does? The answer is supposed to be capital requirements. These are different. They're about how much of the bank's own money has to back its loans, skin in the game. If a bank wants to lend $100, it might need to hold $10 of its own capital, not depositors' money, its own. Capital requirements are higher now than they were before 2008. That's one of the big lessons from the financial crisis. Make banks stronger, more resilient. But here's the uncomfortable part. Capital requirements are complicated. They vary by loan type, by risk assessment, by asset class. And banks are very, very good at optimizing them, at finding ways to make risky things look safe on paper, at shifting liabilities off balance sheets. So the question becomes, do we actually know how much slack is in the system? Let's talk about what happens when trust breaks. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. It wasn't a reserve problem. They had plenty of liquidity on paper. It was a mismatch problem. They held long-term bonds that lost value when interest rates rose. Depositors got nervous. They pulled money. Fast. Within 48 hours, $42 billion left the bank. Not because of fundamentals, because of fear. And once fear starts, reserves don't matter. Capital doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is whether people believe their money is safe. Silicon Valley Bank wasn't even a big player, but its collapse triggered runs on other regional banks. First Republic, Signature. The contagion was fast. The government stepped in, guaranteed deposits above the normal $250,000 limit, stopped the bleeding. But here's what didn't get fixed: the underlying fragility. The system still runs on confidence, and confidence is just a mood. Now zoom out. The $20,000 rule wasn't really about $20,000. It was about the idea that there's a floor, a minimum cushion, some amount of real money backing the illusion. When that floor disappears, even in theory, it means we fully accepted that money is just a coordinated belief, that the system works as long as everyone agrees it works. The moment that agreement cracks, the math gets ugly fast. And here's the irony. We've built an entire financial system optimized for efficiency, for speed, for growth. We've stripped out the buffers because they seemed wasteful, reserves sitting idle, capital doing nothing. But buffers aren't waste, they're shock absorbers. And we're driving faster than ever on thinner tires. The global money supply is enormous. Some estimates put it at over $100 trillion when you include all forms of credit and derivatives. That's not backed by $100 trillion in reserves, or $50 trillion, or even $10 trillion. It's backed by trust in institutions, in central banks, in governments, in the legal system, in the belief that when you swipe your card, the numbers will move the way they're supposed to. That trust has held for a long time, through crashes, through crises, through panics. But it's not physics, it's psychology, and psychology changes. So what happens if it changes? In theory, central banks can create reserves instantly. They did during COVID. Trillions appeared. Quantitative easing, emergency lending, whatever it takes. But that has its own cost: inflation, currency devaluation, loss of faith in the currency itself. You can print money, but you can't print trust. And if trust breaks at scale, if enough people in enough places decide the numbers aren't real anymore, you don't get a correction, you get a reset. History is full of them. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. The mechanisms were different. The outcome was the same. Money stopped meaning what it used to mean. Could that happen to the dollar? To the euro? Most experts say no. The institutions are stronger, the systems more sophisticated, the safeguards better. But most experts also didn't predict 2008, or the speed of the 2023 bank runs, or a lot of things. Here's what we're left with. The $20,000 rule is gone. The reserve requirement is zero. The system runs on capital rules that are complex and gameable, on central bank interventions that assume unlimited capacity, on depositors who mostly don't think about any of this until it's too late. It works until it doesn't. And the difference between those two states isn't gradual. It's not a slow decline. It's a switch. Confidence is binary. It's on or it's off. Right now, it's on. The economy grows. People borrow. Banks lend. Money multiplies. The machine hums. But the machine has no reverse gear, only brakes. And we've spent decades making those brakes smaller. So the next time you deposit money or swipe a card or check your balance, remember, that number is real because everyone agrees it's real. The bank doesn't have your cash in a vault.
They have a fraction of a fraction. The rest is out there, cycling through the system, creating more numbers, more promises, more belief. And belief is a fragile thing. The question isn't whether the system can work without reserves. It clearly can. The question is whether it can survive the moment people stop believing it will. Nobody knows the answer to that. Not really. But $20,000 used to be a line, a rule, a minimum. Now it's a memory. And memories don't stop bank runs.